Hello, my name is Silvia Bottiroli. I'm a curator, festival maker, researcher, writer, and I work in the field of theater and choreography as an expanded field, so field of the performing arts.
Hi, I'm Sara Giannini. I'm also a curator, a writer, and an educator working in the field of performance and performativity. I live in Amsterdam, though I'm Italian, and I work for an organization called If I Can Dance, I Don't Want to Be Part of Your Revolution.
Hi, I'm Massimiliano, Mollona. I'm an anthropologist and I'm based in Bologna. And my field is the anthropology of art and political economy, especially with a focus on class and capitalism or post-capitalism and performativity. And yes, I also am a filmmaker and I'm often working in Brazil as part of my main field work.
I'm Janina Wellmann. I'm very pleased to be here. It's very exciting. I am a historian and philosopher of science, in particular the life sciences, and I'm here from Berlin, and the only one not speaking Italian, I'm afraid. And in my research, I very interdisciplinarily try to bring together arts, performance, science, and I'm always interested in the sort of epistemological longevity of modern ideas and concepts, in particular in the life sciences and biotechnology, and to trace them back to often very old ideas that haven't changed that much despite changes in technologies. And I'm currently a visiting scholar at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, and pursuing now a project on skins and ecologies of skin. So I'm, very much looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, I realized when the conversation was approaching, I just realized something about my relation to the word makeup. Maybe I start with this. It's not a very articulated thought about it, but I realized that immediately the first connection to this term comes to me through the theater and question of theatricality, which is maybe obvious, but also for me comes with a kind of sense of kind of mixed feelings in relation to my relation to the word makeup, and maybe to the certain idea of theatricality as well. Something which I was thinking the other day, I somehow trace back also to childhood, and then to the moment when I started working started being interested in theater, and then working in theater, coming from a small town in Italy where there was no theater at all. And I remember that for many years I would be told or asked something about, you like theater, so you also like indeed to dress, you also like carnival, you also like the idea of taking somebody else, which is something that I have deeply hated in my childhood. And I remember this strange feeling of being confronted with, and then what is it that I'm looking in theater if it's not this kind of pleasure of becoming or transforming into someone else in costumes. And maybe indeed going back to the question of makeup, I realize something that interests me, and something that I'm sure resonates with Sara's interest in that, as far as I know that from your writing, Sara, is also the relationship between makeup and identity, not just in the sense of creating new identities, but also maybe of creating the possibility of operating outside of identity. I'm using identity, but maybe we could also discuss if it's the right word, or if it is the self or subjectivity. These certain kind of notions that are around that, or the possibility of blurring that which maybe also for me connects back to theater and maybe performativity rather than theatricality, as indeed a possibility of thinking beyond the subject somehow, or thinking in a perspective of undoing and becoming at the same time. Yeah, and I would be curious if some of this maybe resonates with you, maybe also having some projections from what I know or I don't know about your writings and the different perspectives that you bring to this, or maybe something completely different.
Yes, I was, when I was thinking about makeup, I was thinking exactly about the way in which, let's say, thinking about Marcel Mauss and the idea of the persona, how individual in a capitalist context tend to be projecting a certain idea of a self, which is implying a certain idea of body and individualism, and sort of body as a container of soul. And I was thinking about the ritual that Gregory Bateson talked about. It's called Naven, which is a collective ritual of collective transvestitism in Nova Guinea, where all the men let's say, dress up like women, and all the women dress up like men, in a context in which the idea is to neutralize certain patriarchal structure that solidify with the small scale, let's say, nuclear families. But also the ritual is very elaborated, and so contains a series of negation of identity. They are kind of paradoxical, but they are performed in a public space, and the public space becomes a space of socialization. And the idea is to exit the bodies and to enter into a collective space where ideas of gender, ideas of sexuality, ideas of economy are problematized. And so for me, makeup implies this ability to transform and to transcend the limits of the body as intended through the capitalist framework. And of course, the other side of this makeup is the making up of quantities of capitalism, the idea that, in fact, the invention of the quantity or the abstract measure or the abstract limit of the body. So to me, as this kind of ambiguous threshold, the makeup is a transformation, the makeup as a fetish or as a quantity that blocks this transformation.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying, both you, Silvia, and you, Massimiliano, really resonates in many interesting ways with how I've been thinking about makeup in the last years and also in the last days while preparing for this conversation. I realized that the term and the topic and the practices connected to it have been really a part of my practice and my thinking process for many years. So also thank you, Silvia, for inviting me. I realized that it is quite central to what I do. I think what is my focus is like to understand makeup not just as something that is applied onto something. For example, even in the English word makeup, there is this sense of invention. You make up something, or parts that kind of come together, or it's a reconciliation of a conflict. It's also, I mean, when you make up a story, so there is this idea of simulacrum, lie, which, for example, in the Italian term is even stronger. Trucco is really like a trick, could also be a trick, a magic trick. So it is in the realm of the illusion, if you want. But I think that what really has been a kind of a fil rouge within my research is to think of makeup as really something that is not applied, exposed, but is already part of the body, is already part of the self. So the self, the face, the surface of the skin as already makeup in the attempt to unpack binaries between purity and invention, between masquerade and reality, and to problematize this kind of binary and also look at what is the real already as a, if you want, as a fabrication or as something that is the product of negotiations and meaning making. In this sense, I wanted to read something that I wrote in 2018 for a book I co-authored with a dear friend of mine, Jacopo Migliani. It's a book about secret languages within queer communities in Japan. And I wrote an essay called Madame Bovary, c'est moi. I'm going to read just the beginning because I think it really brings together some of the topics that I would like to also discuss with you. So here it starts. When I was 16, I devoured Madame Bovary. Like Emma Bovary, I wanted to escape my place, my name, my face, my grace, my fate. Unlike Emma Bovary, however, I've never had an intention of succumbing to my fantasies. Throughout the years, I've trained to live in a state of contradiction. I try still, to break the spell of reality. In this Bavarian state, I went to study theater first and later semiotics here in Bologna. If theater is the realm of illusion, par excellence, semiotics is, according to Umberto Eco, the discipline studying everything which can be used in order to lie. If something cannot be used to tell a lie, conversely, it cannot be used to tell the truth. It cannot, in fact, be used to tell at all. Signs, words, names, they're all masks, hiding and yet revealing that which we want to see but cannot see, let alone possess. Paraphrasing a famous writer who knew Emma very well, we are least ourselves when we talk in our own person. Give us a mask and we will tell you the truth. As someone who only believes in the truth of lies, I recently decided to approach Lacanian psychoanalysis. The subject for Lacan is at the mercy of language. It's nothing other than a semiotic effect. Soon after I started my analytical sessions, I had the following dream. I'm acting on a stage, and like in many of these frightening dreams, I cannot remember my part. I search for props to help my memory return, but nothing happens. It's hopeless. My role and my words have permanently left me. I'm an imposter. In suffocating embarrassment and desperation, I ran backstage, where a childhood friend was waiting for me. We place ourselves in front of a gold rococo mirror. I try to paint my lips, but I'm not able to. The red lipstick slips away. It goes off the borders of my mouth. My face is all messy and dirty in red. I panic. At this point, my friend takes the lipstick in her hands and very gently shows me the way. Look, she utters in a very reassuring tone. It's very simple. She performs the usual gesture of painting one's lips, but in fact, she was holding nothing. She keeps on running her fingertips over my lips, and she leaves no red mark. My lips are bare skin color. They felt right and beautiful. To my great disappointment, my Lacanian psychotherapist suggested that my dream was just a reflection of the unresolvable split nature of our subconscious. Even if structurally impossible, the I still aspires to get rid of all the masks and find its true self. I couldn't believe my ears. I'm sure that what my dream was actually trying to show me was that nudity is a dress. There is no mask. We are the mask. There is no part to remember. We are already playing it. I, myself, can only exist as a sign in transformation. Madame Bovary, c'est moi.
Yeah, it's fascinating to listen to you in a way, because I feel like the discourse is what an anthropologist once has called that the human skin, like makeup, is part of it or not part of it, or is the skin itself or the personality itself. She called it, Nina Jablonski called it a canvas for human creativity. So the skin and what we do to the skin. And it's usually, skin is most often the human skin, and it is a locus of demarcation of a self against the outer world. It's the place where stigmatization takes place, or self-expression, and it's a kind of contact zone. And I have recently started a project that is trying to bring in new ideas of scientific research into skin, and to combine this discourse in the humanities and in recent science, that actually the skin microbiome teaches us that we are a ecological entity, and our skin is not a demarcation at all, but is a living environment for microbes that tightly embed us in the surroundings we live in all kinds of ways. And to understand that it's not only that the discourse, I'm interested in how the discourse we have in the humanities about skins can change if we take in this ecological understanding of skins that has recently been developed in the sciences. And on the one hand, what this does to our ideas about skins, and on the other hand, how if we take skins in the plural, that it's not only the human skin, but all kinds of animal skins or plant exteriors and interiors, that they're all interwoven with us, with the others, with the environment, amongst a universe, how this changes the ideas of the human in the new Anthropocene era we live in. What does it make if we are not demarcated, if we don't use our skins, as you so nicely displayed, as something we use to express ourselves, to hide ourselves, or what this does to our ideas and the discourse about it, if we think about ourselves as just an ecological niche for microbiomes and for all kinds of things living on our skins and changing all the time. So this would be my kind of question to you all, and my ideas to, where to develop this, where to bring in these perspectives, and that's just where I'm curious about.
Yeah, it's very interesting because in a way it's another proposition to intervene within conceptions of identity, what human identity is, or what constitutes human identity. So it completely kind of opened that up. It opens it up. So it's very interesting. But it also makes me think of anatomical discourse, and maybe you are more knowledgeable about this. In modern times, like in medieval and modern times, where public anatomies were also like sites of knowledge production and knowledge circulation around almost the secrets of the body, and how like the skin used to be seen as really like as this filter between inside and outside, as something that kind of keeps the secret of knowledge. And I think it's also very kind of Platonic in a way, like the idea that there is a substance that is kind of secret and deep down, and then there is this superficiality that kind of keeps it really sacred in a way. I think, in a feminist perspective, there is maybe not a chance that then the kind of superficiality is often attributed to kind of female subjectivity, as well as makeup and everything that has to do with the surface rather than the inside. But this is a bit of a deviation. What I wanted to say is that in the public anatomies that were conducted here in Bologna, in the Archigymnasium that you visited these days, something really peculiar occurred in the Renaissance time, which is that the public anatomies were only allowed during the carnival period. which is when the kind of the lessons for medical students were already finished, and then the lessons could be opened up to the general public who would attend the anatomies in carnival disguises. So their identity was masked, was not revealed, and I think there is an interesting tension between the fact that you are there to attend the desecration, if you want, of the wholeness of a body, so to look inside, but like completely protected by a second epidermic layer. So I thought like this was an interesting historical, I don't know if it's an anecdote, but fact that also is, connected to the history of Bologna, where we are, that maybe brings something to the conversation and to what you were saying as well.
It's very interesting what you were saying about the history of the skin, in the sense that I was talking about this ritual through the analysis of Gregory Bateson, who talks about culture through an ecological approach to culture. And so the idea is really that culture are sort of systems that regulate themselves in relationship to modern human systems. Mm-hmm. And so all the ritual, all the rules are basically structured in order to be sustainable in relationship to the environment, in relationship to other humans. And the other interesting thing is that all these subjects are assumed to be without skin, and so to be completely open. And the subjectivity of subjects is made through the encounter with the other. Mm-hmm. And there is also the issue of scalarity of bodies. So bodies are fragments, or let's say fractals of a greater whole that is continuously on the making. And so all the issue that you were saying actually comes into perspective also in this way. So the idea that the skin is not actually a surface, but a space of coexistence already of entities. Mm-hmm. And I think that Gregory Bateson is really interesting because he talks about this greater intelligence, let's say, is more than human, and that contains all this structure mechanism. Mm-hmm. And I also like this idea of the carnival comes into Western society as the moment where the skin can be open and can be, this kind of boundaries or this kind of rigidity can be questioned, let's say. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, staying with the carnival and maybe the question of the surface as it was brought up, so surface not as something separating but as something connected, as something cohabited already, as a place of becoming with one another, and as an ecological place. Because you, Janina, mentioned how skin is discussed and understood in the discourse in the humanities, and it made me think of how much, at least in the field that I work in, we talk about porosity lately, being porous in many terms, in many ways, and it made me think also of the carnival as, something that I've always been very fascinated about the carnival is the idea of a moment of exception, and where no different rules apply, or where common rules can be diverged radically, but also as a moment that has that happens in a very designated time. And still, carnival itself has surfaces as moments where it starts and a moment when it ends. And a question that I realize has accompanied me for a long time, and I like to think with at times, is what happens on the midnight of the last carnival day, when for some it's still carnival and for others it is not anymore. So what is this maybe porosity between exception and norms, or what is this space where an exception can leak into a norm, or maybe form of fabrication of makeup can leak into reality, using other terms that have been used, and maybe in the ecological perspective to that, in the biological perspective to that, there is even more than just that. Maybe these singular terms are not even valid in themselves. Yeah, but this idea of traversability, if it makes sense in English, of surfaces or porosity, of thresholds, another word that has been used. Yeah, and also in individual and collective's body. And since the beginning, you, Massimiliano, brought up with a ritual, with Naven already a collective ritual, and this idea of multitude goes much beyond in your understanding, Janina, of the scientific understanding of skin. While indeed, I also realize I start more from an individual perspective, or this idea of the identity, the self, or the possibility of becoming one other. Maybe there is something different at stake.
I think the point is that science and art in many different ways have constantly in history mutually shaped each other, like in those ideas of what is the ritual, what is the social, the collective and the individual, and it has been very entangled, and probably is not possible to think about it differently, but often, that is my experience in the sciences at least, the discourses still tend to be very separate. So you either talk about the sciences and the scientific facts and not so much about the parameters and the cultural ideas and tropes that go into the way we examine scientifically. And the idea of that, I very much liked your example of the coincidence of anatomy and the carnival, because in anatomy you have to cut open the body, you have to hurt the body, and you to go inside. And with today's methods, you scrap the skin or you do genetic research. You have different methods. You don't have to hurt the body anymore. And the way we gain the knowledge is tightly connected to the way we examine and the procedures we apply. And I think that is something too that is never it's not a coincidence. And when you can do anatomy in the winter month and all the cultural rituals that are connected to winter and the dark light and the change in roles and social roles, I think that is intimately part of the scientific, probably not the discourse, but about the practices and how they were established and how they changed over time.
I think the other interesting thing that I think comes out also from your work is the relationship between science and visualization and technology visualization. And when you have a ritual, in reality, visualization is something that is very embodied in the social context, whereas in science, visualization is a technology that comes out from a scientific setup. And so there is also the origin of Western photography, Western film. So it's interesting also how Western science is embedded in this kind of attempt to neutralize the tool, the instrument, but still the two are very embedded, whereas the ritual relies on the witness, let's say. Even if they're very elaborate, they only work if there is a witness. But I think it's really interesting how art comes into play also from that point of view, in terms of what is the technology of capture, of imagination, or the thought associated with an experiment.
Yeah, that's very true concerning thinking about in art history how even skin was depicted in art, the colors to choose and to find the pigments to represent in the first place. And given that these representations were sent from places far away, what was the value attached to sort of practical choices and material choices that had to be made by the people at those places, how to even find something that represented their 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 perception of some kind of structure or color or surface even. So that's definitely something you cannot separate at all. And it's very interesting and very true, I think, what you said, that in science you have the tendency to link it to technology, whereas it is actually always embodied in a way and much more complex. It's not so easy.
Yeah, and the way you describe experiment also, like coming, the performativity of experiment is a moment in which science also comes out.
Yeah.
Of course, there is then kind of decolonial reading of this, which means that, for instance, I really like Sondra Perry works on the color blue. That is always created in the representation of black skin in cinema. And so this kind of color correction that is always comes into the representation of normal kind of black tone of the skin. Yeah, I think going back to the skin, I think it's and also to the ritual, I think that these are probably differences in relationship to how I'm thinking about non-capitalist or non-Western contexts where knowledge production and rituals are associated, let's say. And also Bateson talks about this, in a way knowledge is kind of comes out from this kind of more collective interactions, which are recognized also exaggerated, so not non-truth. I mean, the interesting thing about all these rituals is that the male are exaggerated women, the women are exaggerated men, very aggressive. And so that all this kind of parody is kind of recognized for what it is, not as a reality. And so it's in a way, it's kind of people are given the chance to gear the intensity of their actions in public. Let's say.
Yeah, I'm thinking about like makeup in relation to normativity. Also, like what you were talking about before, like the threshold between like the exception and the norm, what is in between, what is leaking between the norm and the exception. Because in a way, the carnival, but maybe also this ritual that I don't know, so you of course correct me if I'm wrong. I think normally like this kind of collective rituals are a confirmation of the norm. They're actually executed to reproduce and make sure that the norm can be passed over to new generations. So in a way, it's a form of makeup, using the term, that is used to disguise the norm, but only within an accepted time frame and accepted parameters to then confirm normativity. But of course, I mean, I think it's also interesting to look at moments in which the makeup or the mask or different forms of representation are used to actually undermine the norm, which is not the case of these rituals or the carnival. Within, yeah, of course, drag communities, queer communities, and how actually this is. Yeah, it is really a matter of conventions and parameters, what is considered acceptable or not, because even, well, maybe even more nowadays with the political turn towards kind of the right and conservatism in the West, it is actually not so accepted to walk in the streets in drag during the day, because also another convention is that maybe like the realm of the night is when, you know, you're allowed to, you know, like cross-dress or put a lot of makeup on, but like what happens if you go to work, you know, like in drag or using makeup in a way that is not, useful for the reproduction of normativity. Yeah.
This makes me also wonder, indeed, what's the space of performativity in these practices, and this is a word that we have all used, I think, in our conversation, in the sense of maybe of literally what does something that you do to you? So what does the carnival do to those who experience it? Because now, while listening again to you talking about the carnival, I had to think, yeah, that's true. Definitely, we know these kind of rituals are meant to confirm and strengthen an existing norm, but still, it probably does something to the body to experience another possibilities in terms of gender, in terms of power position. Where does this go? Where does this embodied experience go afterwards? Or, which made me think also of something that I think Elsa Dorlan writes in her book on, I don't remember the title in English now. It's self-defense thing. It's Elsa Dorlan is a French philosopher, and she wrote a book which I think in Italian is titled Autodifesa, self-defense, where she discusses from history and from literature. She discusses some cases of violence inflicted to people at different moments in history and different kind of subjectivities. But violence inflicted in such a way that for the person receiving the violence, trying to defend themselves, to preserve themselves, would cause more pain and more violence. And she discusses many cases in this book, ranging from ancient or medieval tortures, or also some of which are already discussed by Foucault, but for example, to episodes of police brutality towards people of color in contemporary times, and then she goes to gender-based violence as her main topic. But in one of these stories, or in one of these moments where she discusses the past, she says something about, and I don't remember what's the source that she references, about slaves in times of slavery. Some track about slaves having very intense dreams of revolt, or of being armed against the masters, and the power, and something about being deprived of the possibility of protecting themselves, defending their existence, and would create more intense dreams in that sense. And if I remember well, she kind of raises this question also of what do these dreams do in a way. That's maybe a more extreme example of what we were discussing about the carnival. But still, to me, it is a question of how can we address and maybe tackle the possibility of the performativity of makeup in this sense, even in frameworks where this is not meant to, or this is not maybe allowed the power to really create a radically different reality. What does it do?
What you mentioned actually is very nice. It reminded me of Hélène Scarry, someone who wrote a book called Body in Pain, and she writes about the experience of women, especially, and men who have been tortured during dictatorship, and the way in which they perceive their self in relationship to their body. And so the extension or repression of their imagination in relationship to this experience of being subject to torture. And I don't think she has quite the same conclusion, in the sense that the conclusion is that basically people are tortured, their kind of sense of expansion of the body is completely compressed. They feel that basically the body is a kind of cage, but that there is a kind of plasticity in the experience of pain. And that in a way that's an interesting entry point in the relationship between social relations, a sense of, let's say, self in relationship to the body. So, and I was thinking that, in fact, probably all these experimental rituals, at least in non-Western societies, are really about trying to expand the self beyond the body. And the moment of the ritual is a moment in which especially younger people feel that there is this possibility, let's say. And also the other thing is that there are some rituals in Western society that reproduce the power, but there are rituals in other society that basically neutralize the power. And so in that case, it's like a little bit like De Martino was showing some kind of in magical society. There's this feeling that the experience of lack of power, the experience of lack of individualism, the experience that even giving some value or valuable objects doesn't lead to anything. So the neutralization of all the things we tend to take for granted, let's say. And, yeah.
I didn't read the book in self-defense, but I was discussing it with a friend who found it also like very crucial, a former student of mine, Simon van Sarlos, and I understood, or at least these are the terms in which we discussed it, that it is also about how, because within a power relation, like the subjectivities involved are defined by their reciprocity. So within a master and slave, let's say, like relation, or within a sexual romantic partnership, like the two identities, of course, are also like defined, but their relationship and their positionality within the relationship. So I think the question, or at least this is what we were discussing, is like, how can you define yourself outside the terms of the relationship? Or is there a way? And I think this is where also the question of performativity, or the otherwise, how can you perform otherwise, not being this particular subject? And actually, this is also something that I unpacked a bit in my work on Carmelo Bene, an Italian theater maker, filmmaker from the 20th century. The book is called Maquillage as Meditation. And in a play called Sad, Bene intervenes in the slave-master relationship, of course, from his perspective that I call of disidentity. So, like, in a very, let's say, like anti-Hegel, anti-Marxist standpoint, Bene says, like, the only way to kind of implode the relationship is when the slave stops performing as a slave. If you like, that's like, you have to get out of the binary, and not like it's not about revolting to the master, but like not even recognizing that this is a subjectivity that you are performing, but like to completely ignore. So it's really against, in a way, class struggle. So like you have to ignore the dialectics and just go out of it. It's something that deeply fascinates me, and in many moments in my life, especially as a teenager, I found like extremely empowering, the idea that you can just get out of these patterns, but that with time I also became very critical of, or like, yeah, I think I have understood more deeply how over-determining, actually, these patterns and structures are. But yeah, I think a part of me still believes in the radicality of breaking from the pattern. Yeah.
You make me think that, again, in her book Elsa Dorlan, in the final chapter of the book, she discusses a novel, and she discusses the character of a novel, Bella, a woman who at some point experiences some form of sexual harassment from a neighbor, and then she goes through a process of, in a way, of dealing with what she is experiencing. And in the novel, this character will end up going out and killing the neighbor, and then killing other men. So Elsa Dorlan tries to describe this transformation that happens within Bella. And at some point she comes to define that maybe what Bella experiences is not starting from a first moment of reaction where she would close into herself and be very fearful, not go out of the house, etc., to then, let's say, appropriate violence and explode violence. And Dorlan says it's maybe not so much of a metamorphosis, but rather an anamorphosis. And I mean, probably I had known this term, but I encountered it again in the book. And I think it was interesting for me to understand what the definition of anamorphosis would be, which Dorlan describes as a form of transformation where there is no transformation from the outside, but it's somehow a different way of looking at oneself. which maybe goes back to the image of the mirror that has appeared in our conversation before, but also an image that appeared to me also when Massimiliano, you were talking about bodies who experience torture and this idea of body of what is the experience of that body. So Bella experiences something in the possibility of looking at herself differently. And this makes all the difference. This is where she stops performing the role of the victim, let's say, stops performing in relation to persecutor and in that kind of power relation, and opens up the possibility for herself, which is maybe another way or one way of articulating, or maybe that's another way of what you were saying, Sara, not so much of acting outside of that relationship, but somehow I have a sense it's about shifting to a focus on the relationship with oneself, and then there creating another possibility of existence or another possibility of performing a role, which then goes back to that relationship and to that reciprocity, but in a different form, but in a way, overcoming the assigned position or the self-assigned position of the victim, something about this, which is, again, I think, of course, not at all a way of saying that everyone should be able to do this, or that this is a capacity that we should have, but maybe more of a kind of a tactic of, of shifting from a certain understanding of one's positionality in a relationships, something like this. I don't know. Maybe goes back to the trick.
I was thinking also that slavery, there are different kinds of slavery, historically and also culturally. There are some slavery that happens to, again, in kind of small-scale society where slavery is a moment in which you, let's say, embody and include in your society someone that then you dehumanize, but slowly this kind of dehumanized subject becomes part of the let's say family or the group. So slavery is usually a ritual moment in which actually you get to know yourself through the incorporation of the other. And this is kind of small-scale slavery. There's part of even caring for the other. The interesting thing that slavery and caring is kind of quite connected in some society, in the sense that you take someone inside, you dehumanize it, and then slowly you accept them as part of your own humanity, let's say. But there's a kind of slavery in many societies, and then slavery became an economic system, a system of violence or systematic violence only with the Atlantic trade. And so that was when the slave was an object. And so I think the kind of the idea of the Hegelian understanding of slavery comes more for the kind of cultural slavery that always existed in small-scale society, the idea that slavery is a relationship, whereas the Atlantic slavery was much more an economic system in which the subject was not even human, was just an economic good. So that's, I think, where black radical theory located itself, like Atlantic slavery, the Middle Passage was more about the experience of being a commodity that speaks, says Fred Moten, whereas the other kinds of slavery are much more about transitioning to different communities, but also knowing yourself through owning another person. And notion of ownership were much more fluid than in Western society, let's say.
Can you make some examples of these other forms?
Yeah, for instance, there is a book that is called Owning and Nurturing, in which it's represented this kind of form of slavery in the Amazon, where slavery can be happening also in terms of bride wealth. And so, let's say a woman or a young person is given to another part of another community as an exchange for marriage or an exchange for a feud or for killing someone. And so this someone comes into the community as a total unhuman person. Like they ritualistically dehumanized. They are shaved, marks are made on the skin, but then slowly they are actually welcome into the community after 1 year, 2 years, so they become part of the community. And so there's this long process of rehumanization of this person. So slavery has to do very much with this kind of nurturing your community through some other component that is alien to you, but you slowly nurture, it comes into your community as part of your community. But it's based on this mechanism of very violent exclusion at the beginning. And there are, scholars of slavery, for Orlando Patterson and other people that relate this process of slavery as a kind of process that has to do both with care and nurturing and with, let's say, othering, very violent exclusion, which are normally together, very in a strange way. But then Atlantic slavery is different, is where you actually treat a human being as a commodity. This kind of socialization doesn't come into place at all. And in fact, in slave community in Brazil or across the Atlantic, there were no family. Like children were killed because it was easier, cheaper to have another commodity rather than nurturing, let's say, slaves. I was just trying to indicate that slavery is a kind of human universal in a way. The fact that you have another that you dehumanize and then slowly you tend to include them. Whereas the kind of Atlantic slavery is the outcome of this monstrosity, kind of Western modernity and the colonial encounter. Just going back to this idea of slavery as a relationship.
I think maybe an interesting question, because you all raised it as instead of speaking of relationship, using the word you used, relationality, in a more neutral way, if we can at all escape any kind of relationality that somehow gives a sense of self, of being something as opposed to something else, or being something in a particular environment and not in another environment. And in an environment, speaking of societies of humans, societies of animals, of human and animals, in the broad sense. Is it switching relationalities that changes? And what I found particular, you used the expression when you talked about the last chapter in the book and the hero's journey, looking at yourself differently, and that this is the moment of empowering, maybe, or of being at the height of the relationality that you choose, or if you're able to feel like this kind of relationality provides you with something that different kinds don't do. So whether you can, I don't know whether you can switch, whether you can exchange, whether you can even choose where you are. But I think, to me, it seems that this is connected to some sense of being yourself, having these, or feeling at least maybe that you could make these choices. Maybe you can't historically, not always, sometimes you can, some can't. But the way you, as you said, it was put in the novel, it has the sense of making a big difference, as if I don't know the book, but if I understood correctly.
So that this empowerment came from the awareness of relationality. In the case of the protagonist, that's what.
If I understood you, it was part of the idea of treating herself differently because of choosing how to relate herself differently.
Yeah. Or at least this is how I remember it, or how I understood it. Yes, very much. Very much so.
I mean, in a very abstract sense, maybe this is now a bit too abstract, but when it comes to what I'm very much fascinated is, because I'm not working on the complex level of societies, but rather of small, tiny animals and microorganisms, is what actually makes us think that they are alive. Why is something that is living on our skin alive, and when does it stop to being alive? And then what is this idea of, that was what I tried to explore in the book. Is it because they are moving on our skins, because they are changing our skins, because they can be exchanged between skins and environments? And somehow in a more broader sense, I just had this idea when you talked to, she felt alive the moment sort of she could choose the relations. And in a way, if we consider of ourselves as being ecologically defined by the relations we have. So, for example, if you live in a very toxic environment, you will find the traces of that environment on the body, in the body, and going through the body, the porosity you talked about. And of course, these are thinking about modern cities and the way we do have to build our cities to reduce toxicity, because we are part of this environment. This gives us a sense of being able to choose and to say and these choices go deep under the skin in a very profound sense, because they are not just choices about I feel better or it makes but really changing structures deep inside everyone, being exposed to toxicities or having the privilege of not being. So, and this is sort of playing with the notion of being alive from a very basic sense of being toxic or healthy or on the spectrum, or feeling this. You can helps you to understand who you are in a complex social and self-reflective way.
I'm just curious, Janina, how you relate from your position, your studies on skin, for example, and on the multiplicity of life forms that are there on our skins and the skin and the bodies as ecological environments, to the notion of the individual subject. Because in a way now, when some of the conversation went very much to that, and I keep feeling it's hyper contradictory somehow or problematic. And yeah, this idea of as you were very nicely rephrasing what I remember of Elsa Dorlan. So this idea of this character, I mean, deciding for herself, deciding who she wants to be, etc., which broadening the perspective feels also as just very much made up as a narrative, indeed, you know?
No, I think it's I don't know, you're much more versed in literature and culture, but I do think that this notion and the concept of individuality is a cornerstone of literary production, cultural production, even of how cities are built, how we conceptualize, how a museum is structured. And in a way, yeah, much of it is very vague, frail maybe, and is based in an understanding of having exact boundaries of being, and of being the one who chooses to be close or far from something, to immerse yourself into some situation, or to take yourself out of it or away from it. It's all. It has this idea of a very defined surface, and your personality ending at this point. And I think much of our modern discourse is based on this very notion of this is who I am, and I even as a self-representation, I have this idea as a confined, precisely shaped. And all this deep concern we have with the change of our surface, all this cosmeceuticals, this pharmacies about not changing your surfaces, of always staying the same, of being the same, because this is who you are. yeah, I think this is very much part of our culture, and there are ways to put it differently. I would say I don't know exactly how, but I think slowly there are you get these ideas that it's much more complex, and how to come or to find ways that I think is the fascinating thing, how to try to think about these ways or these relations or these notions a bit outside the box.
Mm. Yeah, to decentralize the individual. Yeah, I mean, what you're saying makes me think of a lot of readings that I've been doing recently in relation to disability, chronic illnesses, and the vulnerable body. So like a body that is in itself like not coherent, not completely closed, but injured, open, vulnerable, broken. And actually, yeah, now I can't remember the title of this book, but I read a chapter, 2-3 weeks ago, and it's really beautiful the way in which the author, after losing his voice, like starts to talk about the self as both a subject and an object, or like as not knowing anymore what is the difference between subjectivity and objectivity, and reclaiming agency within that. There is a moment that is very strong, also like as a metaphor, in which he says, like normally, like in science, especially in Western modern epistemology, as a scholar, like you have things on a table, or as a scientist, you have things on a table that you study and you can manipulate, you can look at. There is distance between, like your coherent body and the coherent objects. You're a subject and a gaze. And it's like, I am an object on the operating table of the doctor. So I'm this subject that is actually an object on the table. And what do we do with this position, with this perspective? Isn't it a perspective still? Isn't it an agent? So I think, the knowledge that comes from like scholars and artists and writers within the field of disability justice is really, for me, it's like, I find that it is there, that we can find, that we can nurture a different understanding of the self and the collective, also in the sense of interdependency. So that's also a word that is very used, that is a relationality, but also is a form of interdependency, which is different from dependency, because, I mean, we're all interdependent to each other. And so it decentralizes also ideas of like, within art, for example, ideas of authorship that are very, like based on the individual, but it's about like the distribution of authorship, the distribution of agency, and how we kind of get to do things together, which in a way makes me think of the microbiome, like to imagine oneself as a site of multiplicity. I don't know how to find the source of this author. I'm very sorry. Sorry, author.
One of the things that I think is, I guess, interesting in the work you're doing, for instance, in trying to trace the relationship between science as a form of art, or the visualization of, let's say, capture of movements or capture of the body, is in a way, it seems to be, it's not very clear if it's part of the problem or part of the solution, which is really nice, the way you put it in a way. It's clearly a peculiarity of the West, and I think it is, from this point of view, art as other forms of capture are very much about capturing movement and capturing. But on the other hand, it's also interesting that, in a way, like individualism or this construction that we make to ground ourselves in the world are kind of innate. So all culture need to have a moment in which they emerge as individual, emerge as kind of singular and autonomous. So I just, my question is whether science actually, in my opinion, makes things a little bit worse, because eliminates this possibility of plasticity, of getting rid of that moment in which you can also be an individual, but then you understand that you are relational mainly. That's why I was thinking about this other technology, like ritual technology, through which relationality can be acknowledged at the same time as it's acknowledged you as being an individual or autonomous, an object as well as a subject. So, yeah, I mean, that's my question to you, in the sense that in a very simple way, for me, the West is about capturing movement. It's about all these technologies developed in history, capture, including art and economy. And so, but in your book, it seems nicer. It seems that in a way the West has created this moment in which there's some kind of way of bridging the aesthetic and more kind of military aspects of this capture, let's say.
Yeah, I think this, the way you framed it, I think what is clear for science and art is that movement is endlessly mind-boggling. I mean, it's something that's really, it's always there and it's easy to perceive, but it's so difficult to understand and to grasp as a concept. And in a way, I would say you're absolutely right. It has been part of what the human mind has tried to understand and to work with in all the different facets for centuries. And so I found it endlessly fascinating to think about it. And in a way, what science does, I would say, is it's making things much more complicated the moment in the 21st century it has started to be able to make things in a way of producing things like artificial cells or bits and pieces of artificial cells, or things that are intended to replace the natural existing structures. And the moment science is producing these kinds of things, the question whether these things are made up, in a way, what is the way they do exist? And then the question that that is underlying the book, what does it mean then to be alive if things in nature move, but artificial things don't, unless we make them move or we have something that is initializing movement. But if we do make them now and they move, what does it change for our understanding? When is something alive? How is it alive? And it all comes with this, as you put it, the way we perform movement, and we, in a way, embody movement and try to make it a cognitive concept while sort of experiencing it. And science and arts have done it differently, but often they have done it conjointly in a shared interest, and then put it or moved into different directions. But I do think very with a common fascination and often common preliminary solutions, because then something else. But it is unsolved, I would say. It's not clear where it is taking and where it is going. And I think the switch is coming in the moment we do things in science and pretend this is now the thing and it is the same as the one that it copies, or that the simulacrum, we do something with our means and make it equivalent to the things we find in nature. What does that change? And I think that makes a huge impact, has a huge impact on everything, basically. Yeah.
I wanted to just ask a question. Like, what is the relationship between visuality in terms of like the visual paradigm and everything we're talking about in relation to makeup and representation? Because, how would makeup perform in within a non-visual paradigm? Would it even exist? I don't know. What would it be? And somehow, I think it brings me back to the idea of the anamorphous. Like, if, and to the question of consciousness again. big question. Like, this idea of self-consciousness or self-awareness. Is it related to the visual, or is it something that transcends the visual? It has to do with embodiment. And I think it's all very, it's all informing each other. But I think that we are still speaking within the visual bias. Of representation, which is, the capture, of course, you wouldn't have it without, the visuality. It's so dominant within, let's say, like Western epistemological frameworks, but maybe even beyond that. So, it's a question for all of you.
No, I just to add, I think science is deeply visual. Maybe in a way, the history of science has been a history of making the visual paramount, with reducing the performative elements that are still and have always been there, but which have been, have not been. Or which have been consciously eliminated to make clear-cut demarcations to other forms of practices and forms of knowledge generation. And so this is definitely something science, and especially with this modern data deluge, where you need visuals to even make sense of data you gather, you can't escape this kind of visuality, I would say. That doesn't mean that there are a lot of performative elements, but it's a very good question whether there is a kind of makeup in a sense of, I think in a way there is a kind of, what was the Italian word, trucco? Trickstery, because of the dexterity you need still to do experiments. To this day, there is this element of manipulation in a way of bringing about things where you cannot be entirely 150% sure whether you bring about something that exists or that exists in the context of the machinery, the technology, and the conceptual framework you bring it about.
Yeah, because in a way there is the assumption that what you can't see doesn't exist, or like that seeing is knowing. And also, of course, now we know that there is a microbiome, but we know it because, with microscopes, and it is always about like making things visible, because otherwise they wouldn't exist.
But the paradox is that you don't see these things.
Yeah.
You have the microscopes you have are not optical tools anymore. They have very complicated mathematical, algorithmic, computational procedures that make something visible under the conditions of the technologies you put into it. So nobody can see those. And often these, you have registers of instruments and series of instruments that sort of read each other. And nobody ever looks into what you consider, it's called electron microscope, or it's called whatever kind of technology that is in a way an optical technology, but now in these days they are technologically harvested and the data processed. Nobody looks at these images and doesn't conceive of them as images in a way we talk about images. So you need those technologies, but not to see, interestingly. And I think that is a very interesting twist in a way, because you could look deep into something that didn't exist to the physiological eye with the microscope, but now you have left with this nanoscopy, you have just you have computational data and you have images that are computed.
Yeah.
And you need algorithms, you need mathematical models to create those images. And then you put color to them. And I've just been to, it was fascinating, I think you would like it. It was a conference about data visualization, and the question was about the colorings you choose for what kind of data. And you can find color palettes to your liking. So one you can choose, for example, the Vermeer palette, if you like the colors of Vermeer paintings, and then you have sort of the differentiation of the graphs you have along those colors. So if you like someone else's art, you can use those. And I find this a fascinating sort of entanglement of our ways of how we conceive of pictures and colors we like, and we feel like we are feeling good with, or we feel appalled by, and that are just choices we make according to ideas and conventions entirely outside the scientific realm.
But there is a self-awareness of the fact that these images are actually artificially, like socially constructed, or there is not?
They are constructed, but in a way, I'd say that the social aspect is purely additional. The idea is still there is a scientific epistemology and technology that follows its own laws and rules, and then you have some add-ons, and you can choose those maybe, but they don't change the scientific nature. That would be, I guess, the scientific nature of how you do things.
This is an interesting...
Wake up.
Yes. I mean, this is definitely an interesting difference between scientific Western culture and non-Western culture, in the sense that the image is normally not supposed to mean reality. And so that even if an image is embodied in a medium, there is an awareness that actually that medium hides more than reveals. So there's not the question of truth associated with the image, or the image embedded in the medium, and there is an awareness that the world is fluid, is made of images that are negotiated, and that the one that are embodied in a photo or a film are just a small part of them. And in fact, like I would say, Sara made all this issue about how we look like to each other. There is an awareness of the fact that visibility is political, is about how you fix someone or something into an image. But the other thing that I think is interesting is the idea of visual knowledge, and the kind of disembodiment of visual knowledge in relationship to other forms of other ways of knowing. And again, there are really nice description of how you know how to walk around the land, for instance, in terms of Aboriginal knowledge. There are really nice books of Elisabeth Povinelli, for instance, how you listen to the land, how you access to the land through non-visual forms of knowledge. And I think that's, another big difference.
Yeah.
And I also think that artists and art theory are catching up with the new materialism. And so they are definitely escaping this kind of emphasis on the visual as a kind of macro category, and are thinking more about the matter, how matter makes art, or art how makes images, how makes performance. So, I think it's there's a new understanding of aesthetics. There's more materialistic, like micro elemental, let's say. It's more similar to what you're doing with art. So they're looking at the kind of particles or thinking about Denise da Silva, for instance, work on extractivism. It's really about trying to, I don't say represent matter, but to work through, image that resonates with metaphors of matter. Or,
I also find your question, Sara, super deep, and I'm a bit stuck with that. How much, I don't know, how would makeup perform in a non-visual paradigm? And it immediately made me think of two examples, and now became three, listening to you, of artworks. So maybe I just share some of it. Now, one is maybe, I don't know, I keep feeling an urge to think of performativity in relation, or maybe as opposite to the kind of capture of visualization. And I have to think of this performance that an artist, Marcus Orn, is a Swedish artist. And 10 years ago, in 2015, we invited him in Sant'Arcangelo. That's a small town in Italy, in this region where a festival takes place, Performing Arts Festival. And we invited him to work and to think of a project for the festival. Marcus comes with a very kind of strong imagery and belongs to a very particular music scene, but also he himself and his relation to the body is quite, let's say, strong in terms of also how his body looks. Is kind of fully tattooed, and it really comes from a visual culture that is also pretty hardcore in that sense. And at that time, he had just made a big trilogy in theater, working on patriarchy in different layers and sizes. And it was in a moment of desire of working with a different format and maybe address, I don't know, there was something. What happened is that when he came to Sant'Arcangelo, he kind of realized he wanted to, or he proposed that he would want to work with a group of elderly women. And he wanted to do so also in relation to the recent death of his grandmother, and this feeling he had that his grandmother, as many women from her generation, had never had the possibility of doing something for herself. And he felt very much that towards the end of her life, she would have wanted not so much to do things very differently, but to have space for maybe silly or destructive things. And then he proposed basically to launch an open call and see if elderly women from this town in Sant'Arcangelo would show up and work with them in a way, as a way of creating a possibility for women of that age of doing what his grandmothers could not do. And this ended up becoming a huge and beautiful project. It was called Asdora, which is the name for the housewife in the region. And the project just ended last year, so it was meant to happen for 1 year, and then it lasted over 10 years with a group of women who then, of course, also aged. So basically, it was a collective, very emancipatory and empowering work that the women did with Marcus and other artistic collaborators. By a series of rituals, then they made a big metal concert the next year, and then other performances, and then they visited the grave of the grandmother in the north of Sweden. Many things happened in many media as well. But one thing that was there since the very beginning was a choice about makeup for the women. So they would literally put on makeup every time, and always the same kind of makeup, kind of inspired to the musical scene, also from where Marcus comes from. So very kind of white skin and very strong black signs around the eyes and in the face. And at some point it became very tangible how makeup was performative. Not just, of course, it did also create an image of the Azora. So while they put on that makeup, Marcus started dress as an Azdora, so started putting on flower dresses, or in dresses with flowers, flower prints. And somehow, so the one was transforming into the other, and makeup was a sign of that. But of course, it was also very clearly a sign that allowed these women to do things in performance that they would not allow themselves to do in real life, whatever that means. So, I mean, something that we have already discussed and that we know very much. But maybe I mention it here because to me there is still some interesting tension between these images of the Asdoras from the performance that we have and this sense of the performativity of that makeup. And then maybe I just share these examples and see if something resonates or brings up something else, somewhere else. I remember of a work of another artist whose name I don't remember, so yeah, sorry, artist. And I haven't seen the work, but somebody told me about this. It was exhibited in London recently, I think. And this is an artist who, this artist made a work exposing the makeup remover tissues. I mean, anyway, dirt with of the makeup that they use for a performance. And there is something that I find fascinating in this transferability of makeup from one surface to the other, that maybe comes back to something that we have discussed. But also the idea that, yes, there is a strong element of visualization and even exposition, so these tissues become artworks, but in a way they are also just traces or just the result of an action of, or maybe even now the leftovers of that action of putting makeup on and then taking it. And then while listening, I think to you, Massimiliano, now, listening to you, I had to think of, and again, the paradigm of the visual paradigm. I was thinking, how would makeup operate in sound, for example? And then maybe because you were talking with your examples and the references also of post-colonial theories and decolonial approaches, I had to think of a work by Lawrence Abu Hamdam, who works a lot on sound. And I'm now thinking of a performance this artist just made. It's titled Zip Zafa, which is the name of a wind. And he has been working on the history of the windmills that have windmills. Is that that are now everywhere in many areas over, I think, Jordania and other neighbor countries. And the sound, and he's very much talking in his text about the sound of the windmills and what they produce, and how there has been and there is still a struggle and going on, and some kind of fights against these windmills from both ecological, environmentalist activists and the local people, for two opposite reasons. I found this point very interesting in Lawrence Abu Hamdam, because the environmentalists basically would want the windmills to be taken away because, of course, they produce a lot of sound pollution, and in a way they would want to go back to the silence of these lands. While the people living there, or whose ancestors used to live there, would want the windmills to be taken away in order, they say, to be able to listen to the voices of the ancestors again. And maybe, yes, also this reversibility or transferability of makeup, and somehow maybe the fact that makeup is something that can be done and undone. And then this question with sound, that somehow, yeah, is maybe the same in the sense that sound could also be taken away, but to go back to what somehow, no? Or to go back, or maybe also for makeup. Do we take makeup away to go back to the face, which is the identity, or I don't know. I find something kind of spiraling in a fascinating way there.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned Lawrence Abu Hamdan. Also so he's an artist, but also a forensic researcher working primarily with sound as a forensic tool, and together with forensic architecture and I think Amnesty International, they also, through the testimonies of people who were kept prisoners in Syria, in this like now infamous prison that was just dismantled a few months ago. So through the sonic testimonies of these people, they were able to reconstruct the architecture of the prison, which was completely, off limits. Like nobody knew how the architecture was built, but through different technologies, and this sound became an image. And now that with the fall of the regime, they were able to actually access the building, and it was very accurate, and actually the reconstruction also helped locate prisoners who were kept in very remote isolation cells that wouldn't otherwise they wouldn't be able to be traced. I don't know why I'm saying this, but it is somehow, or I guess it has to do with this idea of truth as well. Is the face is the truth, the visual is the I don't know how we understand truth or the existence or reality. I don't know.
It's really interesting because in a way it's a very technological operation, the way he operates, and all the forensic group is just trying to trace the waves of the sound waves and movements in relationship to that. They did the same with a hospital in a refugee camp that was supposed to have been bombed by Hamas, and then they showed that in fact the sound was kind of the opposite sound.
Indeed, now you're in
the which in a way, I found that interesting, intriguing also in relationship to your work, in the sense that they are developing a kind of scientific epistemology within art, but for a different reason. For a progressive reason. On the other hand, I think it's not become an issue of demonstrating anything anymore in Palestine. It's interesting how that kind of epistemology is jarring with what's happening there. But I forgot what I wanted to say, which was what you said was really interesting. The way you follow traces, and in a way, there's no way to go back. Going back to what? If you avoid movement, noise, do you find silence? Or and something that you speak about movement sometime, how you trace movement. Movement is just a relative categories, because it's like history. It's always progressing or going on. So it's interesting also this, makeup in relationship to what, which also you were saying, the makeup and the surface are the same thing, and so how, in a way, there's no way to remove the makeup. It's just a stratification of new makeup. But I was really intrigued by what you said. When you go back to eliminating the windmill, what do you find? Do you find silence or a different kind of noise?
It makes me think also again about toxicity from a different perspective, as an invisible force, and the toxic side, radioactive sides that are not radioactive per se, or if we just look at them, and how that also made for several communities impacted by radioactivity very hard to fight against radioactivity and to implement laws and regulations because of the invisibility of this kind of toxicity. I had to think about it when you mentioned the windmill and the silence and the landscape.
My first idea when thinking about other kinds of senses involved in our appropriation of the world, when I think the skin is always the side of touch, and visual and sound are long distance senses. They are ways of, we have more choices to position ourselves, and it makes a huge difference where we stand or from where we hear sounds, or and the kind of geographical concepts we have, or the spatial orientation we have, and touch that is linked to the body is a near distance and a very emotion. It's very it's a different kind of sense, and it is, I don't know, the art world in that respect, but it's heavily understudied. You have a lot of developmental biology, of course, that is interested in the sense of touch, because it's vital for newborn to develop a sense of its own body, of the baby's own body, by sensing where it ends, physically ends. So there is interest, and it's vital also for the development of the brain and all these steps in human or animal development. But I think it's important that it is a short distance sense, and that it is a different way of positioning yourself and of proprioception, but of the perception of your surroundings, and it makes something with you if something is very close or very far away, or if you are able to have those traces, as you said, coming from afar to you, or having this closeness to your own body or another body being close to you, and the idea of danger, of inversion or invasion into your space, and where does it end and where does it become uncomfortable, for example.
Very interesting. Isn't it true that a touch became a sense a bit later than the others, or am I just making it up?
What do you mean by
Like by science, now, yeah, I don't know the history. I mean, the historical period, but that up until a certain point, touch was not considered a sense, like hearing and. But I'm not sure about this, so I don't know where this notion came from.
Scientifically, perhaps the interesting thing is that with everything visual, you have optical systems that emulate the physiological system you have, the lenses and the way you construct. You have, not only do you have the technology that is copying the physiological system, but you also have, with perspective, you have the representational form to have the perspective on, and to bring it into a presentation. And you don't have this kind of elaborate technology to measure any kind of sense impression. It's not equivalent to what you have, and that might play a role in understanding and when to determine whether something is an impression of touch, and how to even categorize that. And is it just pressure? It was the first way of thinking about, or the immediate way of thinking about touch would be a way, in a scientific sense of thinking about it, as pressure exerted on some kind of surface. But there is, of course, much more to the impression of touch than feeling some kind of pressure on different parts of the body.
There's this interesting, very nice scholar called Laura Marx. I don't know if you know her. She wrote this book called The Skin of Films, which was an expression of Artaud. And she talks about haptic images as being central to especially feminist theory, but also non-Western art. And I think it's a really interesting issue about the way touch has been sanctioned also in terms of hierarchy and distances between bodies. And not only in the West, for instance, in India, there is a real prohibition of touch because of the pollution, the spiritual pollution that you can pass to each other. But I think it's really interesting how, in fact, feminist theory has approached touch as a space of undoing distances and even power. And I think the performance art has been particularly interesting from their point of view. I think also about feminist performance artists like Carol Schneemann or even Barbara Hammer and the way she was filming.
I so I have a small child. He's 3.5, and yeah, I mean, I'm discussing this in relation to also like learning, knowing through touch for small children, and until very recently, of course, discovering the world meant touching everything. Of course, also like swallowing potentially, but like touching. So touch played really an important role. And yeah, and until very recently, it was quite a challenge actually to go to museums with my child, because obviously you can't touch anything there. So it's a form of knowledge that is, again, like still very visually dominated. Though of course artists have been busy like undoing the visual like for like, I don't know, a century now, but still museums are really, yeah, like yeah, very Kantian, yeah, spaces of enlightenment in a certain way that postulate a certain type of behavior, a certain type of citizen that is able to stand and look and be at a certain distance. So there is this choreography of limitations, no? And touch is really the ultimate no-go. Of course, then you have the exception where you can take, yeah, but anyway, it's an exception that confirms the rule again.
Just in addition, because I enjoyed it so much, coming here in the MAMbo Museum, in the irony exhibition, you have this very nice ice bear that is made of feathers. And I think this irony, this playing with this idea of what you know or want it to be because of some kind of experience and sense perception that you imagine, and how it is counter acted on. I found this very nice. This playfulness you can use to counteract your imagination according to your experience. And for children, of course, having different experiences or not that many experiences might be completely normal. That you have an ice bear that is made of feathers could exist possibly. Yeah. So this is a way of playing with this sense of kind of knowledge you have about, or you think you have about surfaces, because you have it because of your visual experience, but it could be different in different worlds maybe, or at any time, or depending on your mindset.
I wanted to share an image that I went to, maybe you have been already, but I was staying exactly in front of some palazzo where there is a retrospective of Antonio Ligabue here in Bologna. So I went on Sunday. So Antonio Ligabue is a so-called naive artist from the 20th century, Italian-Swiss, who had some physical or like cognitive disabilities and lived a very difficult life, also like in the street, and and was a painter, and he's famous for painting a lot of animals, also animals such as like leopards and jaguars, but also animals of the Po River where he used to wander. And I was quite impressed by there was a small documentary about him, which also won kind of the Berlin, was it Berlin Bear? Yeah, right. The prize at the Berlinale like years ago, in which, so it's a portrait of this artist who at that point, like late in life, became known. And in the first part of the documentary, we see him wander through along the banks of the River Po, and he's emulating the sounds of animals, of the animals that he would, basically that he painted all his life. And a bit the interpretation was that like he was so marginalized by human beings, that like he wanted to find kinship and companionship within these other animal species, and he really wanted to become them. So he was walking around with a small mirror, like doing the sounds, but also wanting to really be like them. And then there was a voiceover, and of course, you know, the gaze was really on him. There was a certain, I don't know, fetishization, I guess, of the character, but I don't know. It was quite, interesting, quite profound. And then, the image that I'm showing here on the table is a photograph of Ligabue in front of a sculpture of some, I don't know, animal, maybe a jaguar or something, like trying to imitate it, but I thought that it was relevant for the conversation, so I brought it today.
Do I remember correctly that Ligabue never traveled to see those animals for real?
No.
Because we know many paintings of him that we know indeed portray animals that he has not seen.
Indeed.
Probably.
Yeah, and in the exhibition there are also I think at that time this kind of like stickers, like figurine of animals became quite popular. So he found inspiration in these collections of stickers that were kind of colorful encyclopedia of animals. So in the exhibition there are also some objects, exemplars. But he never traveled. Besides, well, of course, the more like the wild animals, like he never saw, but like the like the turkeys, the chicken, like those, he was very familiar with them.
This image of the mirror also comes back, even in this image that we are looking at now. Ligabue kind of mirroring, imitating or kind of mirroring the. Maybe responding, I don't know.
Yeah.
Challenging.
Challenging.
Yeah, and it's somehow like through his expression, there is some kind of laughter. At least I feel, I sense. I read then this in a different way. Like this presence changes, for me at least, the presence of the animal or the features, somehow the intention. I don't know.
But then again, it's also only the relationality of that particular moment that is captured, because it's taken out of, I guess, his performance while wandering around, and could have been influencing each other mutually differently. Sort of, now you see a laughter, it could have been being frightened as well the next moment, and being a fluent conversation with him and the animal in a way. But he's the active part. He can change the perception of the animal, not the other way around, because he's still alive.
Seems so.
Yeah, he looks very alive.
I find it beautiful. This image in the. Now we are opening it up in the. I mean, relationship between these two entities, and indeed how we perceive the animal, the image of the animal differently because of the living, fluid expression here captured in an image of the painter, observer. I keep thinking of this image of the mirror somehow, and of looking at some other in the mirror. And maybe I realize I have this image very much of the mirror in my eyes, very much in relation to the theater, to these many images that we have seen of actors and actresses in front of a mirror in the dressing room, preparing for entering the stage, and very often this means putting makeup on, among the other things. So in a way, this process that can be very different in different theatrical cultures, so to say, but of transforming into another somehow. And at least in Western theater, but not only, I guess, it's very much also about this sort of transformation. And these images that I think we have seen, I remember seeing some of this live in dressing rooms at Théâtre du Soleil, for example, where the audience can just have a glimpse of the actors and actresses preparing themselves before entering the stage, and that's a very long process for them. But also the images that we have seen in the movies so much, I think of, I think we all have some in mind. And maybe where in the theater, whereas the fact of being in front of the mirror and looking at one's image while putting makeup on is maybe also a kind of an everyday experience for people who use makeup. Maybe in the theater dressing rooms, then there is something about the otherness of the image that also this image of Ligabue makes me think of very much. And suddenly this image we are looking at kind of makes this space between the two creatures much more dark and dense, in the possibility of doing and undoing one another, of this reciprocity also of the image I'm looking at and what it does to me, and how I am transforming it, but I'm also being transformed by it. Here we see it in two different creatures, but I don't know, kinds of make me think that something similar happens in the mirror sometimes, or in the mirror when there is a sense of, or an intention, a desire, or an awareness of the otherness of the image we are looking at. Which makes me also think of what you were saying earlier, Janina, about in a way our current obsession in our culture and society about our surfaces and this and how they change. And I remember recently somebody told me we were talking about aging, and somebody shared this experience of looking, casually looking or randomly looking at himself reflected in a window and not recognizing this old man that he was seeing, and only after a moment realizing that's me. So this complex relation that we sometimes have with our images, maybe especially in relation to age. I have the and going back to the other senses, it also sometimes makes me think if we don't maybe judge it too easily, these kind of experiences of, he did not recognize himself because he's kind of not accepting, he is becoming that old person. Or maybe it is also because the experience one has of oneself is more complex via other senses and feelings that are implied than just that image. So it's maybe not so much that it's an old man, but it's maybe that this thing is an image, while I know I'm not, somehow.
It's also interesting, the relationship between image and gesture, I guess, in theater. I was thinking about, there's the first page of this book by Milan Kundera, which I think is L'irresistibile leggerezza dell'essere, when the mother sees the daughter coming out from the swimming pool, and she suddenly realized that she's seeing herself in the gesture of the daughter. And I think it's really interesting how performance and theater have that kind of it's more than an image. It's about how bodies embody images, and whether you identify with them or not. And again, there was an interesting study by Bateson and Margaret Mead, which was commissioned by the Schizophrenic Society in the US in the 30s. She was then turned out in this study that was called Dance and Trance in Bali, which was about also state of trance and how Balinese culture kind of believed in the gesture of the dancer to be actually gestures made in a state of trance. And so how the kind of gesture were kind of reenacting some way of thinking about not just images, but also how individuals could change through gesture, let's say. It could be different kind of subjectivities. And for Bateson was an example of this culture being schizophrenic. Whereas then he changed totally his mind, and when he worked much more on kind of LSD in the 50s and 60s, he kind of realized that actually there was a good condition to be, and that the schizophrenic was more Western society that was able to distinguish between. But I mean, I guess I think the interesting thing about performance is how it kind of brings images into life, and it's a kind of illusory space, really. Well, it's much more than an image. You feel an image that is really about subjectivity, or maybe even an essence.
I think it's really very deeply rooted in the paradox of movement, that something is identical while always changing. How do you keep the sense of being an identical you while constantly changing in appearance, and while even constantly, speaking again of skin, you feel like this is your skin and it has the same kind of touch maybe, or softness to it, but it changes all the time. It's never the same since you were born. Every 4 weeks it completely shades off and you have a new skin, and the same is true for your features too, and still you have a sense of identity while physiologically being entirely different all the time. The biological material you're made of has no identity with the one you had as a child or even 3 years ago. And still, and this is the paradox of considering something as changing while being the same. And that's not only true for our own perception, but also for an animal or a pet or an animal you live with. It's still the same while not being the same.
Yeah, it's extremely fascinating and interesting what you're saying, because in a way that's also, I mean, going back again to the idea of like childhood, or like how we teach children, like for as much as I want to avoid categories, I realize that like learning, it has to do with like understanding some kind of sameness. Like you have exposure, you have repetition of a pattern, you recognize the pattern, therefore it is something, it is a category, and it's established as something of that is same, that has sameness, and that of course creates already regions of inclusion and exclusion and diversity, what is not the same. I mean, recognizing a shape, a triangle. You see many triangles, okay, this is a triangle, this is not a triangle. Or it's an amorphous triangle, or it's not well, I don't know. And I feel that within Western epistemology, but also really logic, like, I don't know, Aristotelian logic, it's all about, I mean, induction, deduction, it's all about like extracting a law, a rule of sameness out of the diversity of the world and of change and all its difference and yeah, and I mean, it's at least for myself, it's a kind of aporia or like paradox. Like, how do you get out of it? Like, how do you manage to navigate the world without relying on these categories that I feel that also with my work and the discourse is all about undoing the categories, but then actually that's how you simply function. But yeah, there is so much violence that categories of sameness produce. Then maybe makeup helps us camouflaging these categories, or like helps us accept that we can transform.
I was thinking also about children's play, which are obviously about also defining categories and trying to bring different contradictory logics together. That's why, again, many anthropologists are interested in children's game, because they have spaces where you can believe two things at the same time. They're completely opposite.
Yeah.
And so that's allowed when you're a child, but then there's the kind of education and socialization to logic starts a little bit, starts kicking in. So, but I think we are all probably geared to hold these contradictions and believe in also non-logic. That's my, I don't know, maybe it's also a training that you can go through to, live with this strong contradiction.
Yeah.
Maybe in this sense, makeup is also, or can be also, not just a way of camouflaging, or on top of being a way of camouflage, also indeed, or maybe as a way of camouflage, a form of being two things at the same time. If maybe contradicting what you were saying in the beginning, Sara, but if it is indeed adding another layer or another surface to an existing surface, which is not indeed kind of there to reveal the truth of that, but also not just to hide that, but in a way to let the two surfaces exist at the same time.
I have a question for you, Janina. Do you think a movement is an ontological? It's a category, like is a objective category, or that movement does exist?
Oh, there are many different philosophers you can ask with opposite contradictory.
I know that, yes, exactly. Lucretius and Parmenides. It's deeply in our history of philosophy. But for you, for instance, is it a relative? It's an invention? Because when I think about interrelatedness, I think about absence of movement. If everything was interrelated, there wouldn't be movement. But that's a kind of question that it's interesting, because for me, a lot of my thinking revolves around movement, my political thinking, and also, but then, I'm kind of also conscious that might be not, say, kind of a real category, a universal.
I think I could probably answer on two levels. As a historian, I was very impressed doing the research for my book when I learned that you all know Marais and his chronophotographies, and the way that he was the first to capture movement as a movement, imagining and framing movement as a camera that is depicting or tracing movement while holding on to a body that is moving against a dark background. And he had these beautiful iconic images of the moving body with the performing, often soldiers, having these reflective straps on the joints and the limbs, and so you could treat it. And sometimes, and you have those art historically where you have different frames, like with Muybridge, or you have them all on one plate, so sort of fusing into this graphic representation. And then I learned about a psychologist in the 1970s, Gunnar Johansson, who did exactly the same experiments using light bulbs instead of these adhesive reflective strips. So creating the same kind of representation, but having a complete different idea of how perception works. And he said the way Murray framed movement, that does not exist. We don't perceive something movement against a static background, because in our perception of the world, everything is moving at the same time. And the real conundrum is, how do we perceive that this or that is moving against, as an entity, against a moving background? So why is it that we see a branch of the tree moving while in the background there are cars moving? And why do we have these different percepts in a world where everything is moving? And so he said it doesn't work on the technology of camera and traces. That is not how it works. And he said how it works is that the mind computes movement, depicting some things as percepts moving within an environment of movement as well. So in that sense, I think the mind is very capable of having a representation, a kind of appropriation of the environment in its moving capacities. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to move your body in space, or to have a spatial orientation, and to not bump into something all the time, because something. I think there would be some. That's what I found really fascinating, because often it is, because we have the technology, it's sort of self-evident to understand, oh, that is how it works, but it makes sense that it might be more complicated. And when it comes to going a level deeper into the biology, coming back to this notion of relationality, if we don't understand living entities as shapes or structures or forms that are given, but as processes, constantly processing something within an environment that is itself processing. So inside a cell, for example, there are hundreds of different processes going on in a tiny environment, all at the same time, choreographed into different rhythms and different speeds. It's a highly complex system. And if you try to think about these processes as these movements, then the whole question is, you only have movement in relation, as you said, to some other kind of structure, and where to end this scaling. Because logically, you can just have a relation to a relation, and it never ends. But then you end up with the question, how to order something to make some form in a structure, or in a conceptual framework where you can't speak of something that is given, but always changing in relation to something, and in relation to something else differently. And that is a question that modern process biology is trying to come to grips with. What do we do, and how do we think of living entities if we don't think about structures performing things, but as processes interrelated constantly? And I guess in some ways these two levels go together, but yeah, it's I think cognitively it's a great thing to think about without any conclusion, maybe.
Yeah.
But it's some ways I think it's alien to philosophy. That's not how to the history of it. It's difficult, and it's easier in that to sort of do categorizing along structures and forms and functions, and I think probably this is the first approach you have, and then thinking about it differently comes with, and it worked. There is a lot of knowledge that was produced, so it's not something that is superfluous in a way, but it's more complex than that.
I would like to bring in a question about rhythm, knowing that you also work a lot about that, and I'm currently working on rhythm myself. Maybe from what you were just saying about movement and relationality, I start with a very simple example. I realized lately, or I started being fascinated lately about my perception of moving things, of things that move in some context. And I have two examples in particular. One is I started becoming more sensitive to the fact that when I'm, for example, walking in a forest, or when I'm looking outside of my window and there is a garden, there would be very easily something that becomes strongly visible to me about movement when, for example, an animal is moving. So I realized, in a forest I would very easily realize if there is something moving. Not because the rest is static, but because I started to think it's maybe a different rhythm, the rhythm in which it moves, or a rhythm that operates as a kind of, I'm calling it for myself as a kind of interruption, or as a kind of intervention within the rhythm of the forest, let's say. And this became kind of more vivid. Last summer, I went on an excursion with my partner and with my child in Liguria, in Italy. There is a place where you, if you go in the sea with a boat, you might be able to see some whales, or maybe more easily dolphins, which is the animals that we did. So we went on this whale watching excursion, which means that for many hours you are sitting or standing in a boat, looking at the sea landscape, which is constantly moving, and at some point it all becomes, or for me it all became about, on the one hand, really enjoying this very meditative movement made of repetition, some repetition with differences, of course, but still, and then realizing, okay, I'm only waiting to see some movement which looks different from this one, and which should be a sign that there is an animal underneath, maybe a big mammal underneath the surface of the sea. And it made me think of rhythm, because obviously maybe also because of waves as rhythmical entities, but as maybe also this question about repetition and interruption, or a change in rhythm, as something that maybe I realize for me immediately catches my attention. Which is maybe a way of getting into this complexity of movements and the perception of movement that we have.
I mean, in a way, we are, as social animals, tuned to movements, and social perception is in sociology and in psychology is the sheer necessity as social animals that we need to read the clues of other animals to survive. And so there is inventory of movements that we learned, know instantly, or in a way know how to react to or perceive as dangerous for ourselves, or as friendly when it's a learned. But there is a variety. I think there is this these social clues that we learned to that we needed to learn in as social animals to survive and to distinguish from the kinds of movement, whether it's an impeding act of violence or something that is a friendly approach of something.
Yeah.
And then when it comes to the interaction of movements, then it has to be, in a way, it is the combination of changing bodily configurations when there are bodies interacting in a certain rhythmic or time frame, and they have to be choreographed. If it's depending on the size of the space you have, you need to find ways to have them repetitively or to move around them, whatever, like a choreographer arranges the movement of bodies inside a given space in a given time. And this is, I think that is a way to understand how nature is creatively arranging the complexity of things that are going on and that have to be done to keep processes going inside the body or between different bodies. It's just not doable, I think. And there is this wonderful Goethe quote, or his reflection on it, that at some point he says, nature is constantly operating on the border of chaos. So in his reflection on the metamorphosis of plants, that you always have to reflect the movement into a certain order to get the rhythm, but the moment it loses the rhythm, you have kind of, you're operating on this border of leaving, of turning into the chaotic, and then you either perish or something new arises of it. But it's the system, or it's the necessity of nature to work like this, to be creative, to be able to work economically using the same processes and repetitions, but at the same time never producing something identical but similar. And so introducing novelty.
There's an interesting way in which Tina Kampt speaks about the rhythm of images, especially in Arthur Jaffa. And she talks about not movement but motion, and how rhythm reveals motion. And it seems that, but obviously Jaffa, especially in what's the name of the piece? Love is death, and love is death, and death is greater than love. I mean, the piece that was using different found footage to show the kind of constant racial violence in the US, but it was mainly articulated through rhythm of images and songs. I mean, in that context, it seems that rhythm was bringing a kind of, nearly kind of an undercommon of understanding of movements, like a different kind of consciousness of movement shared by specific communities, especially with the Black community, which was bringing a kind of a different, let's say, tuning across movements that was more maybe across different communities rather than shared. It seems to be a kind of political choice also to escape the visual emphasis, like the emphasis that you have on images, and so to shift from visuality to sound more. But also as a way of recognizing movement on a different level, let's say.
Yeah, there's also this other book by Tina Kamps, Listening to Images, which is very interesting in that respect, because she's really inviting us to, I mean, she's talking about images, how do you call them, like identificatory images? Of mostly African American people in the US, and so she's inviting us to look at these images not actually through a visual lexicon, but like to listen to them and try to tune in the kind of the vibrations of movements that are frozen in these images, so like the fear, the intimidation, but maybe also like some kind of secret acts of rebellion that are like kind of pulsing under the skin and are not visible, but you can kind of sense them through a different mode of approaching. And for some reasons, like I have to think of the work of scholar called Amelia Groom. She's an Australian art historian, and she's currently, for a few years already, like she's looking at the work of Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, who were two artists, writers, and resistance fighters living during the Second World War in France. And from Paris, they went on exile on the island of Jersey in the English Channel, And when Jersey got occupied by the Nazis, they started to perform acts of resistance. And what Amelia is looking at is, so they're quite, especially Claude Cahun, they were completely forgotten for many years, and then like in the 90s, Claude Cahun was a big hit through these images of kind of cross-dressing and gender performativity. But it's also interesting that in a way the art historical canon kind of erased the partner, though Marcel Moore was the photographer of these pictures, and all this was a collaboration between the two of them as lovers and friends, and actually they were stepsisters as well. But Amelia is looking at the way in which this performance is not just a performance enacted in relationality between the two of them, but with the island. So Jersey is an island that experiences extreme tides, so it really completely changes its land dimension and shape. So the fact that they were like continuously changing their appearances and dressing up, cross-dressing, she says like they're performing with the land, with the water, changing shape all the time. Also they had cats, and cats also are animals that are very like malleable in a way. And which I think is amazing, their form of resistance was also inspired by this idea of like camouflaging. So they basically they spread around anti-Nazi, let's say like propaganda or like collages, but also like flyers, but that were written in German. So posturing as if they were like German traders spreading propaganda against the Nazis, so like to drive them crazy, basically. And it is such an anti-identity also form of resistance in which you are getting out in a way like of the identity of the resistance fighter or the victim or the persecuted, where you're just complicating the power positions. And Amelia in her essay also talks about the fact that there is this episode of a Nazi officer who refused to accept that the island would change through the tides. So he said, like, I'm not gonna move. And he died. He got drowned by the water. I don't know if it's real or not, but just the fixation of, no, this is the land, this is what I can't believe that this will change. And I don't know. It's a beautiful work.
very interesting. I was actually thinking about Cloakahun and the work of underground struggle against Nazi. That was, so joyous. I mean, so changing or difficult to pin down. It was about really changing identities, and that nonetheless that was happening at an underground level was really interesting. Just it was such a powerful way to think about countering a very violent actually regime performatively, and imagine that actually that was effective. It's quite amazing.
Yeah.
From what you just shared, I like if we want to that we stay, or maybe that we use it also as a possibility of opening up a bit the question of disguise or disguise of identity, disguising identity. I was thinking the anti-Nazi propaganda written in German as a way of acting or performing propaganda in disguise, or no, and then I was thinking, is it a form of makeup also? No, it made me start thinking of other forms of, maybe in the first place, of political intervention or activism, but maybe also other forms of doing that operate like that, or
I think also the political conditions of the present are in a way encouraging these forms of disguise. I think they are important to revisit. I mean, I know also, like, I mean, not that probably in Europe we are moving in that direction, but in the United States, since certain terms also are considered, I don't know what, illegal. I don't even know like what is the term, but like that within faculties of gender or critical race studies, like people are kind of using different language to disguise and to protect themselves. So in a way, it's also a form of survival, resistance. But it's interesting also in relation to, I don't know, like the performativity of social media that we're very accustomed to, also for activism. You know, that is actually, I mean, it's always about like projecting an identity or an image, and it's going to be interesting to see what is underground, what can be underground, or kind of activism in disguise within certain media. Now I can't, I don't have examples in mind that use more like contemporary technology. Maybe we will know about them in a few years, I don't know, in the future.
It's interesting also the historical part of makeup, as you were highlighting, moments in which the term means different things.
Yeah.
There are different possibilities. And yeah, I think I agree with you that it's an historical moment in which we will have to disguise ourselves much more, probably, and you don't even know if it's possible, it will be possible.
Mm.
And I find it interesting that you are kind of also landing on language now, I think. After discussing a lot the visualization and the visual and images, anyway, what are the possibilities of language as makeup or
Mm.
yeah. Also in terms of in many dynamics that I think we see today of appropriation of language from different sides actually and with different intentions, but also sometimes what I am seeing more is also in Europe is strategies or tactics of not using the language that we would normally use in order not to, in a way, reveal how we think about things in certain contexts where we feel they become more dangerous. Like I remember having a conversation with numbers of colleagues in the last months while we were all writing funding applications for artistic organizations, and we normally would use inclusive language. In Italian there was a need of inventing an inclusive language in the sense of gender.
Mm.
This is the language we would normally use in all our text and communication materials, and most of us decided not to use inclusive language in the funding applications in the end, which we also perceived as wrong somehow, but also as a needed gesture of protecting what we are actually doing by not making it so visible or not making it so much into a statement in this current moment. And I'm still very ambivalent about this decision. I don't think it's necessary, right? And then it makes me think about invention of if there is another way, which is not about appropriating existing language or in a way disappropriating or question of identification and disidentification with existing language, but what possibilities we have in terms of invention of language. Maybe in a bit in a sense as makeup is not necessarily transforming into another that we know what or who this other is, but transforming into an otherness that we don't know or don't want to define, and that is not capturable in that sense, or maybe as ritual is not about men dressing up as women and the other way around, but dressing up as some entity that has no name yet. I don't know, it's maybe a bit romantic, but
No, I think it's very relevant, and I think it's that on the one hand, and maybe it has to do also with, let's say, to put it simply, like questions of anonymity, for example. So, like, how to use language in a way in which the identity is disguised. I mean, maybe it's not about the language, but like the emitter, the sender. I mean, I think in the case, for example, of pro-Palestine activism, it's quite evident. There are clear, people are being clearly targeted for their activism. So there is really an urgency of protecting one's identity, while at the same time not disguising the language, because I think that's the point, no? In there, like how can you still use the language you want to use? Talking about the genocide, talking about ethnic cleansing. I mean, how you continue to use the language without exposing yourself. And I think then there are different strategies which can be collectivism, for example. If you collectivize the identity, then it's not the one person that is then persecuted. Yeah.
That's really similar to the notion of opacity or relationality. Lisan, which is about socializing, not about disguising. So when you socialize, a statement becomes untraceable in a way.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. And of course, the transparency of the clear language has always been privilege of power. So in the same way in which the transparency of the image has been always the transparency of the white image for bell hooks, but I think it's on the other hand, the censorship on freedom of speech is really worrying. What's happening, for instance, in the UK or in other contexts.
In Germany.
In Germany, yeah. So, and it's also interesting to think about language as a term that is not, again, necessarily linked to the logical language or written language or some kind of language of the media as a space of articulation of a narrative.
Big question, maybe also not language, and I was thinking also in relation to scientific language as also, I guess, a language that has a responsibility of describing and in a way being close and faithful to a reality, that, but at the same time a language that by describing also makes up a reality or discovers all this. I mean, because in the end it makes something known that was not before, probably, also in that sense. So, yeah. And I like a lot the reference to opacity and glissant, which is also a term that is widely used, I think, in our field at this moment. But also maybe in relation to makeup and what we've been discussing, also this idea that, I mean, for me, it kind of counterweights a certain desire for transparency, for knowing, maybe very much connected to visuality, indeed, knowing by seeing or knowing by being able to define something, and makes a space for uncertainty, for, in a way, holding on into a space of not knowing, but also a complexity of adding layers. And sometimes which is also a reference that Lara Favaretto shared in relation to this project, this misty. So she talks about the misty nature of a conversation, this fogginess somehow, this materiality of what makes something opaque, which is not by taking a layer away, but more often by adding extra layers in between, let's say, a subject and an object, or a subject that is looking at something as an object.
It's nice. Makes me think about the materiality of the makeup you were describing. So kind of this, you add in layers rather than take them away when you speak and you communicate, not necessarily clear the field. Like you add in complexity, not necessarily so often we think about communication or talking as a kind of efficient activity that create this kind of empty space that then you can fill again. But I really like this idea of adding layers of complexity to a conversation that doesn't really create an empty space or clarifies, but in a way it's a more kind of way of looking or searching through layers that you add.
Okay, thank you for this conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening.
Yes, that's true.